thank you all for actually attending my talk. I am going to talk about OpenDaylights' upcoming distribution, Helium, which we'll try to go over a sneak peek on how it is going to be delivered and why. And also, I want to make it a bit interactive, both from a hands-on perspective and also from a community feedback perspective. So I hope that we can also learn from you and try to find out how you guys see, how do you want to consume OpenDaylight. So basically, the title of the talk is OpenDaylights Apache Karaf based distribution. That kind of started as a side project within the OpenDaylight control project itself, where we wanted to remove or decouple the container from the actual project itself. For those of you who used hydrogen before, who's familiar with hydrogen in the room? Okay. Who's familiar with OpenDaylight? All right, that's good. I was just checking because I would have first introduced a bit what OpenDaylight's about if half of the room would not know what I'm talking about. So to get back to what I was saying is that hydrogen was the controller, or not only the controller, but the controller, the components, everything, along with the container itself at the same time. So as part of the distribution, you would get a custom tailored version of the container that was bundled with the project. So a lot of people have put a lot of work into making that piece work. But as we'll find out, sometimes it's better off to reuse stuff. So today I'll go over really a three-part journey. So I'll talk a bit about the problems and solution. Then I'm gonna go over a small user's hands-on demo, or basically just how to get started into installing the features, maybe gathering some of your user feedback. And part three, if we get some time for that, I'll dig down into more when you actually develop with that sort of container. What do you do? How do you do it? How do you bring the bundles in? And what can you do with what cool shell commands do you have, right? So for those of you that are a little less developer inclined for that last piece, you might find it a little more heavy, but don't worry, I'm not sure we get there. So for hydrogen, just a small retrospective, and sorry for being in front of the slides. So basically what we had 14 projects, so it wasn't too bad, and the community was pretty good at handling that. So what they did is try to think, how can you consume OpenDaylight? What makes sense out of these 14 projects? How can you bundle that in units that make a sort of sense? So they basically came up with, and it's also what you have in front of you on the chair, with the architecture and the notion of the editions, right? So for those of you that have been familiar with the hydrogen release, we had these editions. And as part of these editions, you would have, the first one would be base edition. So what would base edition be? It would be a couple of southbounds, just enough to actually get the controller going. You'd have the network service functions, the abstraction layer, along with only like the base functionalities like OpenFlow plugin and ways to talk with the actual devices. So that was your typical base edition. Then you'd have the virtualization edition. Virtualization edition was actually bringing in other network virtualization technologies that usually try to own the whole world, right? So these components, most of the time, will be standalone components. So it's really using the controller in a specific use case. In this case, the network virtualization use case. That actually had in it the VTN, Affinity, OVSDB. So VTN, OVSDB, and OpenDove were all network virtualization technologies that were doing similar goals, and as such were part of the virtualization edition. Then, for more the service provider inclined, we have the service provider edition. That added a bunch of network service provider stuff like BGP or PSAP, BGP PSAP, Lisp, SNMP, you know it, Defense for All. So it really was adding the more service provider oriented features as part of that edition. So it would actually be ready to run from the box. The thing is, and that where things got a little bit messier was Helium. So Helium, 25 projects proposal. We have twice as many. How do you actually categorize all that, right? How do you actually make this all into release editions? Well, before we actually got crazy within the project, we started to investigate how we could actually address that issue, because it is not a trivial thing, and with all the experience in working with the community and the people with hydrogen, well, everyone was coming and saying, well, I like this and that component, but I would like to add that as well as part of my custom flavor. So it was always the edition that didn't exist, right? So, and so what we've actually been contemplating for Helium is, and I'll talk more about that, that's where Karaf comes in, right? What's Karaf? What's Apache Karaf? Is everyone in the room familiar with it? Who's heard of it? All right. So, as I was mentioning earlier, the current controller is really a mix and match of runtimes. And by mix and match, it's a little bit of stuff there from Apache, a little bit of stuff there from Eclipse, and a bunch of versioning issues. So, not to blame or not to actually point fingers here, but it was not easy to do. It's not a trivial thing to assemble, because you need to actually go and have the know exactly all the libraries that were involved. And for hydrogen, there were 255 bundles. So that means 255 third-party and OpenDaylight libraries all together in a big, huge lump, right? So that's what we had. And that mix and match went only so far. It wasn't too bad, but we said there must be something better out there. There must be a way that we can reuse what the community did, because we're not the only ones that have been doing that over the years, right? So if you're familiar with Fuse or Service Mix, well, Service Mix and Fuse had the same issue. They developed their container initially, and what happened is they kind of spun it off as its own project, and that project is Karaf. Karaf in French, Karaf, is actually a wine. Well, you know what a Karaf is, right? So it's a container. So it's a wine container. That's where the name comes from, and that's how they kind of named it. So it is the container in which your application will run, or applications. And in this case, it is the container in which pieces of the OpenDaylight runtime will run. So is it perfect? No, but at least it's a lot better than what we had before. And it's a good start in order to improve from now on. So what's Karaf actually bringing to the table? Well, first of all, and we'll see that in the more hands-on section, we have a nicer console. So we do get a nicer shell, CLI, that you can have fun scripting, especially if you're more assistant type of people. Then you have the logging part. So we have proper logging, proper, easier ways to handle all the logs in a more centralized place, be able to retrieve them, and so on and so forth. Then you have the deployer. The deployer is just a place where if you want to make it your own custom extension, well, you can just package the whole thing as a plugin if you want and just dump that into the deploy folder, gets picked up, you can install it. Provisioning, well, the provisioning, it's all about features, and I'll be talking about features quite a bit because now OpenDaylight will be a lot feature-oriented. And then finally, a couple of administrative functions. So some of the security stuff is also available as part of the container. It allows you to have some access control lists either on the shell commands or on the console or the JMX console that you would attach to debug or do stuff. So that JMX stuff might not make it into Helium as a side step because there was some technical incompatibilities, but it is going to be there right afterwards. And then you have also the blueprints, so the XML, Spring, VM-ish way of wiring things. So Karaf, when I mentioned features, what's actually a feature? And that's a bit of what brought some of the people in OpenDaylight to look at that is it allows you to group the bundles into logical subcomponents or into logical units. Maybe not components, but at least logical units. So it makes it easier to know the whole hierarchy of dependencies that is involved within OpenDaylight itself, right? Moreover, you can actually version that as you go. So if someone else is actually dependent on you, well, they can have a different versioning cycle. They can actually manage it very differently. So, Helium Revisited. How are we going to consume or provide Helium, hopefully? It's the ice cream bar. So it is going to be a choose whatever you want buffet type of situation where you'll be able to choose the components you want to put. And these components, you can actually do different things with them. You can either create your own distribution, you can actually turn them on or off, maybe not at runtime, but you might need to restart eventually at runtime. And so the ability is to actually get rid of the notion of editions for Helium, right? Yes?
So I'm confused by this concept. Is OpenDaylight going to be testing these combinations of modules as part of their release criteria?
Yeah.
Okay, all right, so.
Yes, so that's the testing we've been actually putting together is that we test the different combinations of modules. There are some that are incompatible with each other because they're doing exactly the same thing, and in other cases it's because they're owning the world, right? So that's also why I'm saying that the features themselves or the notion of an installable unit is not enough for OpenDaylight. Okay. So you need to have a notion of a component, have a proper life cycle for that and so on. But that's going to come in Lithium. So we're taking baby steps in Helium and at least providing proper units that are installable and testable. And then from there, we will revisit the life cycle and see how we can actually make that even better from a Lithium point of view. But good question. It is actually something we've also been concerned about. Any other questions so far? No. So it is an ongoing effort. That's 2 days ago. So
no, that was last
yesterday.
night.
Yeah, sorry.
It seems like 2 days
so
ago.
It seems like 2 days ago because I haven't slept much. But we are still working on it. We are, 4 weeks from the release, is it? Or 5 weeks?
About 5.
5 weeks from the release. So everything is coming together, but we are in a heavy integration and rush mode at the moment. So that's why you'll see my demo, or the hands-on, I'll show you the concept, we'll see how far we get, but it's always a challenge. But for the release, the good news is it's all gonna work well. Because right now, each of the components have been tested more or less separately, so we're going through the final phase of pulling the whole stuff together, and that's the project herding type of work. And thanks to George here, which is helping quite a bit on this. So it is work in progress. It is something that we are looking into, and it doesn't preclude preparing distributions or preparing other custom things. So you could roll out your own, or just makes it very easy to create something and assemble whatever you want, right? So it's not precluding the notion of editions, but at least now you know what you're putting in. And whether that's done through a download link, a download page, or at runtime through a graphical user interface or command line, it's all up to you guys. And that's also why I'm trying to I hope to get a bit of the feel of the crowd here just as a sampling to see how you guys would like to consume some of that. So I'll jump into some of that hands-on session so that you'll be a little more familiar with what I am just talking about. Is there any questions before I actually dig into the hands-on portion of this? All right. So, actually, pretty nice. Okay, we'll start small, and the final scenario might work, so it's success. All right.
All engineers work.
Yeah.
We understand.
So basically, there are two things I didn't mention. I skipped over a couple of slides, but I'll go over these two before I actually go into the hands-on period. We were supposed to have something even more integrated, so that's why my slides were a little bit more. Just give me a second if I can start that slideshow. Probably have it started somewhere. Yeah. So I'll just go quickly into what we'll be doing quick. So the first thing, the prerequisites, is to have an image. So have the distribution image. It will be downloadable. There's a link that will be sent to you so that you can actually go download it and run this. There's also you need Java and ideally Vagrant if you want to get to test the OpenFlow stuff. So the first thing is really to unzip the distribution. Then we'll run the container. We'll get to see how the container behaves, the shells. Then we'll install the a feature as an example and a couple of features, and we will access the APIs that are brought by installing that feature. What's coming? I'm just giving you a small sneak peek of what's more in the pending patches. So what's in the pending patches is the ability to install all that from a user interface. So you won't have to do the CLI way of managing it. So whenever you get the first base zip container, well, you'll have a little nice wizard that's gonna guide you through your initial, what do you want to do with this setup. And from there, you can always go and change the features or change the values or anything you want as within the feature pages. So that's all done. It's just not all merging. And another thing, and that I can actually show live possibly, but well, yeah. So that's something we are working on, and that will also be available at release, and you'll find very, very interesting and important if you are working with this edition, is the ability to do and to go into a Project Explorer above you. Okay, the Project Explorer actually creates a map of all the features that we have within OpenDaylight that are provided by any project, and what are the dependencies between all these features. So that is very nice. However, you'll see that there's also this little tab here, which is, it's not there yet, but I'm working on higher level constructs. So you want to admit, yes, features are nice, but you see they're very low level, low granularity. It's not how you would consume it as an end user or as someone that's interested. It's very useful from a developer's point of view because you can bring in only the pieces and components you're actually using. But when you're user facing, that granularity is very low. And yes, you can do meta features and higher level features, but just having a small description like that is not enough, right? So we want to tie that into with documentation, with the actual test coverage and other metrics, so that you know exactly that if you're bringing in that component or that piece within OpenDaylight, then you know what to expect. Is it experimental? Is it good? How, like, not really branding, but actually letting the user know, because there are implications to the components, and not everything in OpenDaylight has the same maturity. You guys are familiar with open source project. I think it's the same pretty much everywhere. So, yeah, so basically that's what's coming, and I'll just dig into the hands-on piece now. All right. So in order to actually go ahead and make this happen, what you'll want to do is you'll want to have an OpenDaylight distribution. That OpenDaylight distribution is that download link, and will be available. I'll start with the controller one. The controller one is basically the distribution that is attached to the controller project. It is limited in scope, as in it doesn't really have all the other components that you would want in as part of an integration. It is simply just the basic controller level features, so you don't get OpenFlow plugin, or you don't, it's just the plumbing, right? So when you're actually working within this, you're actually working with the plumbing pieces. You don't have like any real functionality. Then if we're lucky, we'll go into integration where we do have an OpenFlow plugin integrated within the distro, and we'll see how that reacts when we actually load up Mininet with an OpenFlow runtime. And finally, I'll also explain a bit how you actually develop in this environment, because how do you actually log, how do you attach a debugger, how do you list the bundles. So that's the last part of what I'm going to show you. Right? Any questions so far? Feel free to stop me at any time. You guys have been awfully quiet. Either you're bored to death or yes.
Is there any discussion, and I know this is probably really a touchy thing, you talked about the maturity of each component.
Mm-hmm.
If the developers of that component had wanted a way to basically signal that it was sort of not mature yet, but go ahead and try it,
Mm-hmm.
is there any way in the panel that could be displayed?
Yeah, I've added that extension to the XML description of the components. So I will display it as part of the Explorer and also in the GUI. So I think it's very important from a user perspective, and we only care about the users mainly. So they need to know what to expect whenever they install the feature. So no, that's that will definitely be there for the release. Right. So basically, if you've built or if you've downloaded the distribution is you'll get either a tar or a zip. Personally, the way we package at Dinoset, the distro, we use CoreOS based. I mean, it's very close to a CoreOS port, but and we actually use Docker on top of that. So that's the way we package it for specific reasons. But we find that this downloadable zip is also a very good way. We do it only because of the updates. So, all right. So let's first start the container. I'll just. Do you guys see the lines, or it's too small, or? Good. Okay, perfect. So when you get started, the first thing you get is you'll get the shell, right? So there's two things you can actually do. You can either in the base distribution, you'll have the GUI also automatically loaded. It could be turned off through configuration for those of you that bring this into another system and don't care much about the user interface. But otherwise, the default will get to have a small minimalist UI. So what you can then do is you can go and list all the features that are available within the container. So if just in order to list the current features of OpenDaylight, and don't be scared. So we have about, without the projects, that's only the controller features. So the controller features are about 40-ish features. And then you'd have about this 25 or 27 of them for the projects. So that's the current quantity of code that you'll find in OpenDaylight. OpenDaylight is actually pretty big for its age. How many million lines of code? I think it's what, 1.5-ish?
Ish, yes.
Ish. So
these features are sort of the granular level that you can start building from. Right?
Yeah,
Okay.
yeah. And these can either be started at start time or integrated into higher level features. So as part of that, there are also higher level component features that allows you to basically bring in a lot of stuff with a single command or get a user interface, right? So we don't expect people to understand all that, but it's important for the people, and this is a more developer-oriented talk, and that's why I'm trying to explain the logic behind the smaller features. So if I, for example, want to bring in the system that configures everything, then you can always do something like ODL config all, and that's going to bring in the config subsystem. So then if I just feature list and grab on ODL config, then I see that all of them are now installed as part of their state, right? So that's the way you would actually bring in things. So let's just, as an example, in OpenDaylight, if you look at, I wonder if, I'm pretty sure it might not be on your diagram, but yeah. So in OpenDaylight, there is that notion of SAL, or service abstraction layer, and as part of the OpenDaylight history, there's been two versions of the SAL. There was the 80 SAL, which was API driven, and then there is the MD SAL. which was a model-driven abstraction. These two styles are kind of two different stacks that exist within OpenDaylight. While we're trying to reunite some of that, it is still the fact that you still have a lot of dependencies. And the community so far has been converging on some of these specific stacks. So I'll just bring in the toaster example, which toaster is an example of the plumbing, right? It is not an example of any useful feature. It simply allows you to see how the model-driven plumbing works. So let me just, so now we actually got the toaster, we'll just verify, but, right, so toaster is in, everything's running. Now in order to actually do something with it from a REST point of view, let's just install RESTconf. Okay. So RESTconf is a REST API on top of OpenDaylight. It has become the central way of accessing the submodels. There are other northbounds, but RESTconf is definitely the one that's being maintained the most and that's being used a lot by the newer user interface. So
what type of applications would call RESTconf?
Basically, any types of apps. I'll give you whenever I'm working with customers or people, what I'm doing is it's really to gauge where do they need to put their application. Do they need to do it within OpenDaylight or do they need to put it on top of? And that really depends on how fast you need to do things or how you need to do things. So how do you want to react and how will you do things with the model? Are you simply, for example, changing flow rules or applying policy, or do you need to be reactive to a point where you need to coexist within the actual controller runtime, right? So that's always the analysis that you need to do, and there's no right or wrong answer. We'll see that happening in the future, right? And one other thing I've been fairly interested in is also providing that application. I'm giving scoops, but it's also providing that application runtime within the controller in a controlled fashion. So right now, if you look at the way the applications exist, is most of them own the controller, right? And that is a huge issue. It's good for like use case apps, right? When you have a single app that's doing something, as I mentioned earlier, like network virtualization. But in other cases, when you want applications to coexist, it is not as obvious because they can step on each other's toes, right? They can add policies or add flow rules that, if we're talking OpenFlow, for example, they can add policies or flow rules that conflicts, and there's absolutely nothing at the moment that's preventing that from happening. So that's something that we need to address as a community, and there are plans to do so. Right, so we got RESTconf in. So let me just have a, hopefully, sorry for, yeah. So let's postman that and see. Yeah, it does. Thank God for that. So basically, we got the toaster stuff in, and it actually allows you to see the toaster state. So through the RESTconf interface, toaster has a little bit of it's an example provider of state that has a status and model number and stuff like that. So it's really just a sample on what the model would be. I'll now try to get into the OpenFlow example with the exact same thing. So that basically is the whole OpenDaylight plumbing. You'll tell me, okay, well, we brought in what, maybe 60 to 70 bundles, and there's no real functionality. And I would agree with you, because the functionality here is just to make sure that we can do model augmentation. It's just the ability to route the messages properly within the actual components so that you can support these abstractions, that you can have a flow abstraction that goes netconf, that goes OpenFlow, that goes whatever, which is the main difference between OpenDaylight and some other controller projects out there. It's really that fact that we acknowledge that there is a hybrid world out there, and there's not a single way, a single protocol to rule them all. And while I am also a big, we're all SDN related here, so I am also a big OpenFlow fan for some use cases, and it is, but it is just one way of doing SDN, and I'm sure there will be more coming, especially with some of the data planning that's being done. So. It's important to keep the options open, especially at the control level, and to know exactly what to expect, right? So now that we actually got this up, I'll go into the integration one. We'll see if we can get a topology going, and we also will cover a bit of the bundles. In the meantime, while this is actually barking, do you guys have any questions? Any ideas on how you would like to consume OpenDaylight? Any thoughts? No? All right. So as long as you get a good GUI and the ability to turn things on or off, is that okay with you? Yes.
I'm interested on the OpenStack integration.
I'm sorry?
From OpenStack integration.
Yeah.
The neutron and stuff. So the API that
Yeah. Well, a lot of, exactly. And well, that's, okay. From an OpenStack integration point of view, there is the neutron side of things, and there's the underlay side of things, right? So the underlay side of things will likely, and I'm talking, that's the vision of some people in the ecosystem, but the idea is really to have the underlay managed a little more by OpenDaylight, and while there are, there's Tusker and there's OOO and there's still an ironic, the relationship between this and the bootstrapping process is easier done via OpenDaylight. So that's something that some of the OVSDB guys are looking into. And of course, OVSDB is really the main way to integrate with, well, not the main way, but it's one of the good ways to integrate with Neutron. Sorry, there's a couple of other alternatives, but OVSDB is definitely an interesting one, an interesting approach. Yes?
I have a dumb question about Karaf.
Sure.
Is OSGI still accessible when you're using Karaf? Can you go below?
Yep. Yeah, and it's definitely not a dumb question. In fact, Karaf is a set of syntactic sugar around your whole OSGI environment. So it allows you to see what's happening, debug things, and make things a little easier as a user.
But if you needed to get down below it, you
yeah, you can always access. And I'll show you a bit how you manage the bundles, and that's the next piece. If I can. How much time do I have?
About 8 minutes.
Okay. All right.
maybe not.
Maybe not. So instead of going in distro, I will explain a bit about what I just mentioned. Otherwise, just bringing up the mininet stuff is probably going to take my 8 minutes. So we'll just, just give me a second, guys. And Of course, you will never have to live that nightmare if you're actually using it. But if you are developing against it, you'll find that it's a lot easier than it was if you've ever tried to do things in the current OpenDaylight environment. So to get to the point of working with OSGI, what's very nice, and you'll see that if you download the slides, is you have a bunch of very nice commands to work with your bundles. So it starts with bundle list, which will list all your bundles given a specific threshold. So if I don't want to see all the system level bundles, then I can just threshold at a specific level and say everything that is OpenDaylight, which is after 35, I want to see it, and I don't want to see all the system ones and so on. So that's a very nice feature, and you can go and everything above 100 is actually your own bundles. So it's something that you would actually create, and you don't want to see the list of all the OpenDaylight underlying bundles. You simply want to see yours. Then you can actually work by using everything above threshold 100. So there is that notion of bundles, and there, I'll just give you a small example. What's very interesting as well is the tree show. So what you can, if you're not too sure of what the dependencies are from a bundle perspective, is you can actually do tree show with the bundle number, and it's going to give you the whole dependency tree for that bundle. Very, very useful functionality to work with. Another cool thing is if you are using Maven, and you will likely be if you're using if you're developing with OpenDaylight, is you can do a bundle watch. A bundle watch is a function that will watch a specific URL or ID of a bundle, and whenever you Maven compile and Maven install it and it changes in the repository, it's going to reload automatically there. So that makes the development cycle very quick, so that whenever it's built, it's already reloaded, ready to test, ready to run. There's also the find class method, which is pretty good, which allows you to find a specific class. I'm trying to find one off the top of my head, but yeah, that's not gonna find. This is the package. But so if you would, like that. That should probably find it. So find class actually search the bundles. So it actually searched the bundles so that you will try to list the bundle that is providing that class. It's very useful to find when you're actually looking for specific environments. There's also feature info that allows you to, bundle info, which allows you to get additional information like description when it's provided, and there's bundle headers, which will give you all the manifest information. So you can really debug your OSGI environment properly with Karaf, whereas if you have the normal Equinox shell and so on, it's very limited in the actual things that you can do at the bundle level. There's also the bundle diag function. When things go wrong, it's going to list exactly why it didn't start and why it doesn't work and so on. So that's very useful from a development perspective. There's also all the feature commands, which are very important. So what you can do is add or remove repositories. So in order to add stuff to OpenDaylight, you would create your own features with the feature repository. Then you would do repo add to that repository, or you would do your own distro. And from there, you can feature install everything that you've described in that environment. So you can bring in your own features, bring in your own ways of doing things within the OpenDaylight environment. And there's also the log, which is very, very neat. It allows you to, first of all, not have a bunch of trash on the shell, sorry for the terminology, but you don't get a lot of garbage on the shell. And it also is very easy to work with. So you can basically log. You can even log your own messages, like type of situation, and you can set. That's weird. Sorry. And you can actually set your log level to any log level you want through the shell or through the configuration. So if you're debugging something, you're trying to find out more about it, you can set debug only for a specific sublogger or any class or whatever, and you don't have to go into all the logback XML changes and so on. So you can do everything from the command line here, and that's pretty neat. I think I might have a last sub item, and yeah. So the last things is there, and there wasn't the old OpenDaylight, but there's still an SSH daemon, so you can SSH into that, or you can turn it off if you're security concerned about it, but it is part of the initial distro, and can easily attach a remote debugger to that. So that's really a quick overview of what to expect in Helium, and if you have any questions, feel free to share your thoughts and everything with me. If you also want, just we'll send out the download links with the full image that you can actually give it a spin, give it a try, and that full image will have the GUI as available. So feel free to comment on that as well. All right. Thank you a lot for attending the talk. I hope you've enjoyed that sneak peek, but more will come when we actually release the thing in September. Thank you. Woo! Thank you all for actually attending my talk. I am going to talk about OpenDaylights' upcoming distribution, Helium, which we'll try to go over a sneak peek on how it is going to be delivered and why. And also I want to make it a bit interactive, both from a hands-on perspective and also from a community feedback perspective. So I hope that we can also learn from you and try to find out how you guys see, how do you want to consume OpenDaylight. So basically, the title of the talk is OpenDaylight's Apache Karaf based distribution. That kind of started as a side project within the OpenDaylight control project itself, where we wanted to remove or decouple the container from the actual project itself. For those of you who used hydrogen before, who's familiar with hydrogen in the room? Okay. Who just enough to actually get the controller going. You'd have the network service functions, the abstraction layer, along with only like the base functionalities like OpenFlow plugin and ways to talk with the actual devices. So that was your typical base edition. Then you'd have the virtualization edition. Virtualization edition was actually bringing in other network virtualization technologies that usually try to own the whole world, right? So these components, most of the time, will be standalone components. So it's really using the controller in a specific use case. In this case, the network virtualization use case. That actually had in it the VTN, Affinity, OVSDB. So VTN, OVSDB, and OpenDove were all network virtualization technologies that were doing similar goals, and as such were part of the virtualization edition. Then for more the service provider inclined, we have the service provider edition. And what can you do with what cool shell commands do you have, right? So for those of you that are a little less developer inclined for that last piece, you might find it a little more heavy, but don't worry, not sure we get there. So for hydrogen, just a small retrospective, and sorry for being in front of the slides. So basically what we had 14 projects, so it wasn't too bad, and the community was pretty good at handling that. So what they did is try to think, how can you consume OpenDaylight? What makes sense out of these 14 projects? How can you bundle that in units that make a sort of sense? So they basically came up with, and it's also what you have in front of you on the chair, with the architecture and the notion of the editions, right? So for those of you that have been familiar with the hydrogen release, we had these editions. And as part of these editions, you would have, the first one would be base edition. So what would base edition be? It would be a couple of southbounds. That added a bunch of network service provider stuff like BGP or PSAP, BGP PSAP, Lisp, SNMP, you know it, Defense for All. So it really was adding the more service provider oriented features as part of that edition. So it would actually be ready to run from the box. The thing is, and that where things got a little bit messier was Helium. So Helium, 25 projects proposal. We have twice as many. How do you actually categorize all that, right? How do you actually make this all into release editions? Well, before we actually got crazy within the project, we started to investigate how we could actually address that issue, because it is not a trivial thing, and with all the experience in working with the community and the people with hydrogen, well, everyone was coming and saying, well, I like this and that component, but I would like to add that as well as part of who's familiar with OpenDaylight? All right, that's good. I was just checking because I would have first introduced a bit what OpenDaylight's about if half of the room would not know what I'm talking about. So to get back to what I was saying is that hydrogen was the controller, or not only the controller, but the controller, the components, everything, along with the container itself at the same time. So as part of the distribution, you would get a custom tailored version of the container that was bundled with the project. So a lot of people have put a lot of work into making that piece work. But as we'll find out, sometimes it's better off to reuse stuff. So today I'll go over really a three-part journey. So I'll talk a bit about the problems and solution. Then I'm gonna go over a small user's hands-on demo, or basically just how to get started into installing the features, maybe gathering some of your user feedback. And part 3, if we get some time for that, I'll dig down into more when you actually develop with that sort of container. What do you do? How do you do it? How do you bring the bundles in?